All right, welcome. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you may be on this world. We are here for another episode of Pluralia Dialogos, where I'm very happy to be joined by Kit Klarenberg, an exceptional journalist, somebody who has been at the cutting edge of intelligence gathering, of just trying to make sense in a very, very effective way of how the world is being mismanaged and being run into the ground for a number of years. You've been on my radar for a long time, Kit, and so I was very happy when you said that you'd be down to join me for a little bit of a chat about where the world's at. How are you doing?
Very well. It's my absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, great. And all of Kit's Substack, the work you've done on the Grayzone is going to be in the description box of this video. Kit, we're going to be joined hopefully by Ray McGovern very shortly in the course of our discussion. But before he jumps in, we might as well get the ball rolling. The world has been going through some incredibly surprising, I would say in many ways, unforeseeable turbulence. It's been a whirlwind, a complete whirlwind. And I know when we had arranged to have this original show topic, the world was in a slightly different place. I think in some ways we were much closer to a full-on World War III scenario than we are today. But that being said, I hear a lot of people celebrating, dancing in the streets, that the golden age is nearly upon us, and other people are saying, no, this is just a trap. You know, you don't set up generations worth of planning to destroy Iran in order to simply walk away from that so easily. Where are we right now in your assessment of the world situation?
Well, it's very difficult to unravel because, like, I mean, you use the example of Iran, for example. Like in Iran, we saw the culmination of avowedly decades of careful planning by Israel to attack Iran, and an extraordinary, almost incalculable amount of financial and military aid being given to Israel. And actually, by like day 3 of the conflict, it was clear they were in very serious trouble. Like and initially, you've got to bear in mind that initially that Israeli officials were talking about regime change, and actually it's ended with Israel suffering billions in damage. They were running out of missiles within a few days. So I mean, Iran may not have secured an outright victory, but that is a massive loss for Israel and its Western puppet masters. Ukraine's been rather shunted off the mainstream agenda as a result of what's been happening in West Asia, and we see mass daily Russian advances there. Russia is quite clearly pushing into new areas, and I strongly suspect that the ultimate end objective is to conquer more territory, including Kharkov and Odessa. Historically Russian lands, which are comprised of Russian speakers, many of whom identify as Russian and have strong sympathies with the Russian government. Not that you would know that from mainstream reporting. I do think, and I think this is the wider topic for discussion, a key stumbling block to the multipolar world emerging, or at least an attempted stumbling block, is provided by the British, because ever since World War II, towards the end of that conflict, British military and Foreign Office officials lamented in internal memos and communications that, well, once this is all over and done with, we're going to be spent as a military and economic power globally, but we can hope to steer the emergent US global empire in directions befitting our own interests. And I think that ever since then, yes, the British have consistently sought to embroil the US in conflict, to solve problems they themselves have caused, deliberately or not, around the world. And I think that they are very, very, very wary of a withdrawal of quote unquote US global leadership. because their continued relevance globally is entirely contingent on US hegemony. And piggybacking off that, and all of the intelligence and military support that comes with it, and I mean, this was spelled out very, very what's the word? Forthrightly by an individual who I've written about extensively called Chris Donnelly. He is a veteran British military kind of defense apparatchik. He was a NATO advisor who spearheaded NATO's expansion into the former Warsaw Pact and Soviet sphere following the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe in 1989. I mean, he is now personally overseeing Britain's contribution to the Ukraine proxy war, which is one of endless escalation and insane follies, such as the Krinky landing or the invasion of Kursk by Ukrainian forces. Now, if you go back all the way to July 2014, there was a British parliamentary in which Donnelly advocated for training Ukrainian forces, and he explicitly stated that this was an effective means of neutralizing President Obama's shift to the Pacific, the alleged Asia pivot, which happened and it seems is unlikely to happen. And the rationale for this was that the pivot had, quote unquote, taken US eyes away from Europe and the Middle East, where Britain has for centuries sought to maintain its own hegemony. I mean, I think that there is a push within well, at least certain elements of the power structure within Washington towards a more insular, a more, yes, America first kind of agenda. There have been numerous comments by Trump and his, most senior cabinet members that, that they did kind of understand that the era of unipolarity, which was created by the Soviet Union's collapse, is well and truly over, and there is significant competition in every sphere from emerging powers, in particular China, but also Russia to a large extent. Now, the American strategy in Ukraine, and I have been saying this since the very first day of the proxy war erupting in February 2022, was to try and grind down Russian forces and all along collect intelligence on their war fighting strategy, etc. I think we've reached the point where it's spun out of control, and the US is very keen to step away from it, not least because they are providing, well, they have been providing Ukraine with so many munitions and weapons and vehicles that they can't easily replace at any pace or scale at any speed. Now, this on the one hand is rather encouraging in terms of, well, I mean, this kind of spells the end of the war in Ukraine, but European powers are seemingly desperate to hang on to keep this madness going, and there have been numerous European leaders. I mean, Macron is an endless source of belligerent and, quite frankly, insane statements about the need to counter Russia. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas from Estonia likewise seems convinced that Europe can take on China and Russia. She hails from a country that is the size of a very small Russian city, that there is that push within European politics to ratchet up the belligerence and get on a war footing with Russia. We see this with Christian Merz in Germany. He's the new German chancellor who, using very corrupt and dubious tactics, used after winning the Germany's elections last year, he used the existing parliament, before new parliament had been sworn in, to sign off on a huge rearmament program, and has spoken with an incendiary rhetoric about green lighting German strikes deep inside Russian territory. This rhetoric does have real world implications. I mean, we can only hope that cooler heads, common sense, and indeed public will prevails, because if you look at polls of Europeans, I mean, the numbers of people within European countries who are willing to enlist in the military and fight and die to defend their lands is extremely small. There's no, as far as I'm aware, no European country where a majority would be willing to sign up to this. There is mass European opposition to conscription, which has been mooted. There is mass European opposition to increased defence spending, and rearmament as well. And I think that this is because Britain understands that the US withdrawal from Europe would leave them much weakened in the process. They are absolutely determined to keep the US focused on Europe when the US has interests elsewhere, which are far more important than some squabbles between people in a faraway land of which average Americans know nothing. Right? Like the majority of Americans can't find Ukraine on a map, for example, and I'm sure the same is true of people in Britain. But there is cause for cautious optimism, because there does remain, on top of public opposition to this, there does remain within certain sections of Europe's political elites a sense of, well, we are sleepwalking into a likely disaster, we've kind of forgotten this notion of peaceful, constructive dialogue between our countries, whether that's Paris, London, Brussels, and Moscow. You can't have a European continent which is A, divided between East and West, and B, are at each other's throats. For example, it doesn't make sense. But at the same time, I can't rule out. I don't think that we collectively can rule out the prospect of Britain doing something to further inflame and escalate the situation in order to keep the US involved. I have reported at the Grayzone on leaked documents in which senior British military and intelligence officials talk about the Biden administration's reluctance and hesitance to get fully involved in the Ukraine proxy war, because it was always intended by people like the aforementioned Chris Donnelly to use Ukraine as the beachhead for a wider all-out war between the West and Russia that the West would win. We fast forward to today, it hasn't really worked out as planned. The much vaunted sanctions against Russia have not produced the results we were told they would. In many ways, they have strengthened Russia's economy. All of the much vaunted Western Wunderwaffe that has been sent to Ukraine has pretty much universally, with certain exceptions, been shown to be completely useless in an actual war scenario. There was a report by Britain's House of Lords. Of course, this is the unelected parliamentary body that oversees the work of the elected parliament. Last summer, they produced a report called Ukraine Wake Up Call, where it effectively concluded that Britain would be completely defenseless in all-out conflict with Russia. It doesn't have the soldiers, people aren't enlisting. It doesn't have the technology. It doesn't have the weaponry. It is reliant heavily on status symbols vessels like aircraft carriers that frequently travel the seas without any aircraft on them because Britain can't source the jets. They also have, their Trident nuclear submarine system, which consistently fails in tests, and there have been reports that the British military has been rather pathetically reduced to fixing damage to these submarines using super glue. So again, cause for cautious optimism. And we saw throughout the first half of this year, Keir Starmer, along with Macron, were making a number of belligerent statements, and if not outright commitments to deploying forces to Ukraine to fight alongside the Ukrainians. And then we fast forward to May, and quietly these plans were scrapped. Anonymous senior defense officials briefed the British media that, oh, we never took this plan seriously and we were never going to do it, and we always thought it was crazy, and it was the French that really wanted to do this. And then you have op-eds in the Daily Telegraph and other mainstream publications by Keir Starmer from a few months earlier, where he openly declares his willingness to deploy British soldiers to Ukraine. So there is this sense of like, well, once reality comes crashing, and you're on the brink of doing something which could lead, would inevitably lead to a mass routing and huge amounts of casualties, that they tend to step back. Another cause for kind of a strange juxtaposition of optimism and bleak dooming is the fact that Europe has ever since the end of World War II, it has structured its defenses and it has structured its infrastructure in the belief that the US would come to the rescue invariably. And now that question is quite rightly, is being very seriously asked. Like, would the US actually would the US cavalry come to our rescue if it came to it? They are increasingly doubtful of this, and numerous comments by Trump and his government suggest that this is not the case. A few days back, Trump said, well, Article 5, this notion of collective defense, if one member is attacked, then they're all attacked, and then they will all declare war on the attacker. He stated, well, it can be interpreted in many different ways, which is a rather euphemistic way of saying, we're not going to help you. Actually, like, we're not going to risk American lives to defend Estonia, say. As I say, the British are in a desperate situation where they understand that their clout and their reach and their influence is severely waning, and I would not put it past them to do something, whether that's a false flag attack or something similar, to try and drag the US back into the game. It must not be forgotten. For the first 6+ months of the conflict in Ukraine, Russia was avoiding any targeting critical infrastructure of any kind. It was reported in the Washington Post that how lightly Russia was conducting its so-called special military operation was baffling Pentagon chiefs who had expected this mass kind of Iraq war. Precisely. And then they didn't do this. The trigger for Russia starting to target Ukrainian infrastructure, particularly energy infrastructure, which has had a ravaging effect on the country, was the October Kerch bridge bombing, which was masterminded by Chris Donnelly and people around him. So and they again, their explicit purpose was to provoke Russian escalation and keep the Americans in the war. They may well do something like this again, or whether Trump will be swayed by it is a different question.
Yeah, no, and I really appreciate the fact that you've got the finger on the pulse of the British intelligence, not as something of the past, but really as an active agency within the present, which many people overlook. And I think it's a big mistake, considering that when you even dig behind the surface of a lot of the stories, the narratives behind what got us into some of the most destructive military maneuvers in the last 25 years, even, you can't avoid the head of British intelligence even providing the so-called evidence of yellow cake and weapons of mass destruction that was picked up by Colin Powell and used as the basis of arguing why we needed to go in militarily into Iraq, which had nothing to do with the events of 9/11 whatsoever. But again, it was 10 Downing Street that provided that intelligence. It was Richard Dearlove, that the head of MI6 at the time, that cooked that up. It was Richard Dearlove that deployed Christopher Steele, another MI6 operative who was in charge of the Moscow desk of MI6 in the 90s, to go and craft this creative fiction called the Russiagate expose that was used to really disrupt Trump's first term in office. And we have just so many points of evidence that this is not just a relic of the past, but, as you've pointed out, an active agency. Now, in your recent string of essays that I've seen you pull together, and you've been really good at this over the past number of years, but in the last several months even, you've pointed to things like Project Alchemy as a very important dynamic, I guess, a branch of British intelligence within or stirring the pot in Ukraine. Could you say a little bit about that specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I'm more than happy to say more than a little bit about that. And I think that, effectively, Project Alchemy was a secret military and intelligence cell that was created by the Ministry of Defense immediately following the eruption of proxy war in Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. Within days, I mean, this collected ex-spooks, military veterans, academics, etc., to put together a wide variety of often quite insane plans to quote unquote keep Ukraine fighting at all costs. Now, I mentioned the Krinky debacle, where Ukraine spent 9 months feeding wave after wave of poorly equipped, poorly British-trained Ukrainian Marines to try and seize a beachhead in Russian-occupied Kherson, which the British believed would allow the Ukrainians to march on Crimea in total victory. In reality, it was a complete turkey shoot, where most Ukrainians who were sent to Krinky were killed en route by Russian drones and artillery. Those who reached Krinky were often killed within seconds of arrival, and it fizzled out after 9 months, having achieved none of its operational objectives. We have learned from recent reporting by the Times of London that the disastrous 2023 counteroffensive was encouraged and mapped out by the British. Now, if you go back to files that we've reported on at the Grayzone, dating back to February and March 2022, they're mapping out all of this stuff at that time. From at least from Ukraine's perspective, the proxy war has evolved according to a script drawn up, nearly 3.5 years ago by British intelligence, and it has been a catastrophic failure, both from their perspective, but also from the perspective of the British, because it hasn't produced this grand all-out war between the West and Russia. It hasn't caused the collapse of Putin's government. In fact, Russians are more united than ever. And Putin enjoys, kind of unprecedented levels of popularity. That all of these plans are backfired, but they're still hanging on because they understand that a loss in Ukraine, and you could very well argue that they've already lost. It's just, the matter of degree by which they are defeated, that's in question at this point. They understand that would be an absolutely massive blow to their piggyback power, like over the US. You know, and I think, I mean, you know, you mentioned historical precedents for this, including Richard Dearlove cooking up all of the WMD, the false intelligence around WMD. Richard Dearlove, I might add, in a British TV interview, called me a unpleasant little journalist and named me, and that I see that as one of my greatest professional achievements. But in all seriousness, that there is what a lot of people forget is that in 2004, the US Senate Intelligence Committee, it released a report on intelligence failures around the war in Iraq, and it specifically has these amazing passages in it which talk about how the CIA is so reliant on foreign government services, which is to say MI6, for reporting on countries, that the potential for manipulation of US policy by foreign interests is absolutely massive. And I mean, we just have to look at, you know, you mentioned, Russiagate, which was cooked up in Britain. Again, Chris Donnelly was centrally involved in the promulgation of this nonsense, among many other false tales of Russian meddling and destabilization across Europe, which was all preparing the foundations for war. It's quite clear that the potential for manipulation of US foreign policy by the British, if not others, remains very much an issue. And I think that again, this is what disturbs me, because when Project Alchemy say our objective is to keep Ukraine fighting at all costs, you know, wrapped up within that is an acceptance that, well, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Ukrainians are going to die, but we don't care. Wrapped up within that is an absolute determination to, yes, just keep this grinding on at completely unsustainable material and financial and human cost. But they don't care, like, you know, because they desperately hope that something will happen that will finally get the US involved in this as much as they hope can happen. Although the fact of the matter is that, you know, this belief in US cavalry, it is based on an outdated, highly outdated and actually ahistorical reading of US power. You know, we have seen the US Navy basically be defeated by Ansarallah twice, Ansarallah being the Yemeni resistance group, twice in under a year. You know, operate both times, when Biden launched Operation Prosperity Guardian, when Trump at the start of this year started a campaign against Ansarallah again. Both times we were told that Yemen was going to be absolutely decimated, and both times the US ran away with its tail between its legs. Yeah. The US strike on Iran which we were initially told was one of the greatest military successes in history. It is becoming increasingly clear, based on, you know, leaked Defense Intelligence Agency assessments and the statements of senior Pentagon officials, that the attack was basically flaccid and empty. You know, and I think that hesitance, lack of major involvement by the US, I don't necessarily think it's deliberate restraint. I mean, of course, they could resort to nuclear weapons if they really wish. But I think it's a reflection of US military weakness. You know, this is something that I've written about for my website, shameless plug. For many years, for 3 decades, in fact, the US has been wedded to this notion that air power trumps all other forms of warfare, to the extent that over a quarter of the Pentagon's massive $1 trillion budget is allocated to the US Air Force. And then the next kind of biggest recipient is the US Navy, which of course usually works hand in glove with the US Air Force, because US aircraft carriers ferry around US jets to carry out bombing campaigns. Now, in the immediate aftermath of Operation Prosperity Guardian ending, which was in, I believe it was July or August last year, initial media reports painted a completely disastrous picture of the operation. There was an Associated Press article which interviewed a number of US sailors and pilots who were involved in it, and they described the experience as very traumatizing because they're not used to getting shot at. And the Pentagon, as a result, was considering implementing programs to provide mental health counselling, not only to the soldiers and sailors and pilots involved, but their families as well. I mean, the US military machine is structured for carrying out mass gang beatings against completely defenseless adversaries. We now live in a world where Ansarallah, which is a relatively unsophisticated resistance group, can give the US Air Force and Navy a pounding using drones that cost $20 with some explosives attached to them.
Yeah,
well,
we saw the example of just the sort of unfortunate sight of this military parade in Washington not that long ago. Where the American soldiers couldn't even walk in sync. It was a bit sad to watch such a sight, but it just showcases how detached from reality the American military practice as a whole has become, with drone warfare. Really, just things that are so far removed from reality that we don't know how to even march in sync. But all that to say, it does seem so. There's a couple of different hypotheses floating around pertaining to the logic that was guiding the entire 12-day war, as it's become called. We hear that. So there's what you just outlined, the idea that the U.S. has become incompetent at being able to carry out things, even despite its gigantic military power. That such little groups like Ansarallah are able to subvert their intentions just by launching weapons, carrying out certain drone attacks, blocking off things pertaining to the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. But then, at the other hand, you have evidence that we've seen Reuters point out that Iran had informed the U.S. and Qatar hours prior to their counterstrike, and Trump had said something to the effect that after 14 missiles were fired from Iran's side, Trump said, "They got it all out of their system now. I want to thank Iran for giving us early notice, which made it possible for no lines to be lost, nobody to be injured." And there is a superficiality to the U.S. strikes themselves onto Iran. I'm wondering how much of this, in your mind, was pre-planned sort of kabuki theater to do a bit of an off-ramp and avoid this giant calamity, and how much of this is as serious as some say?
Well, I mean, I think that, it's been openly reported by, I think it was the New York Times. It might have been the Washington Post. They're indivisible in my mind at this stage, I must say. But it has been reported that this was intended as an off-ramp, so all sides could kind of stand down. I think that the fact the US strike was, it seems very clear based on just satellite imagery that it did not inflict the damage that we were told it had. I find it very difficult to believe that B-2 bombers, which the US didn't dare deploy in Yemen, were sent to Iran. You've got to bear in mind that the strike also happened while Iran and Israel were trading fire. And neither side appears to have noticed B-2 bombers flying across Iran's contested airspace, dropping literally earth-shattering bunker busters, and then flying away without detection. But I think that one of the things that really jumped out to me actually was that after I mentioned there was this leaked DIA report on how the damage was insignificant, and actually it's probably at most set Iran's nuclear program, which is not a nuclear weapons program, it must be stressed. The head of the IAEA, Grossi, he on June 17th stated that we have no proof that Iran was preparing to produce nuclear weapons or had any intention of doing so. Might have been helpful to say that before Israel started bombing Tehran and killing civilians. But the point is that I think that sorry. The point is that in response to that DIA report leaking, we had this kind of mass flurry of US officials, including Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth, but also CIA Director John Ratcliffe and Tulsi Gabbard, the head of the DNI. They all issued very fiery statements claiming that actually these strikes had been very decisive, they'd been highly destructive, they had wiped out and obliterated Iran's nuclear weapons program, and that was completely off the table. Of course, the US governments, or indeed any Western government or government agencies and their leaders, are not typically known for being able to admit failure, but I think this actually goes a lot deeper, because if you zoom out here, what prefaced this bombing first by Israel and then by the US were months of negotiations which didn't really seem to be going anywhere, and have since been claimed by Israeli officials to have been a ruse to lull Iran into a false sense of security and make them think that strikes weren't coming. The negotiations have been put on indefinite hold by Iran. They have very little incentive to continue them. The IAEA, given that based on leaked documents acquired by Iran's intelligence ministry, has been handing data over to the Israelis, including the names of nuclear scientists who were subsequently killed. They're not going to allow IAEA inspections on their territory ever again. And so, one of a utility of claiming that, we've taken out Iran's nuclear capabilities is, well, we don't need to have negotiations anymore. So, sticking to this polite fiction that these 3 Iranian nuclear sites were completely decimated and Iran has no chance of developing a nuclear weapon. Well, that source of grievance is resolved, therefore negating the need for further talks on the subject. Now, we just very quickly, we mentioned before, we discussed earlier about Britain's central role in cooking up the WMD hoax, which led the US and Britain into war in Iraq, with calamitous implications both for the country and the wider region. I have, as of we're saying this live now, but hopefully in the next few days, I have an investigation coming on how MI6 was also central to cooking up intelligence that Iran was developing nuclear weapons, and was instrumental in the sanctions program that was implemented between 2010 and 2012 against Iran, which the Obama deal in July 2015 overturned some of these sanctions. So again, the path that led us to this rather perilous point in history may well lead straight back to London again. As I say, I think that the story of the post kind of World War II period is one of the British endlessly attempting to steer the US in a highly belligerent direction all over the world. It must be remembered. We haven't even mentioned Syria, where MI6 took the lead in collecting alleged evidence of government chemical weapons use. Mainstream reports on this explicitly state that the purpose was to get the Americans all in on regime change in Syria. And that this was the purpose of the tests being conducted. These chemical weapons attacks were, being staged by British assets on the ground, like the white helmets. So like, and then we fast forward to today, and Assad has finally fallen, and the former U.S. ambassador to Syria from 2011 to 2014, I believe his name is Robert Ford, gave a talk recently in which he stated that he was approached by a British non-governmental organization and asked for help.
Peter Ford, no?
Yeah, sorry, Peter Ford. Sorry,
yeah,
excuse
right.
me. Yeah, so there are too many Fords. But yes, that basically that he stated that he'd been approached by a British non-governmental organization and asked for help in transforming HTS into politicians from Al Qaeda and ISIS-derived terrorists. Now that British non-governmental organization was Intermediate, a company that has contracts with MI6 and other British government agencies, and is led by Jonathan Powell, who was a key Blair advisor, an architect and advocate for the Iraq War, who's now been named current British Prime Minister Keir Starmer's chief national security advisor. So as early as 2023, if not before, HTS were being groomed for power by the British, and they wanted the Americans to sign off on this. What a deadly web we weave when we practice to deceive.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well said. There are striking similarities, I find, in watching a lot of what's going down right now to what happened between Eisenhower, as far as the Anglo-American relationship was concerned under the days of Eisenhower, when the U.S. was pulled into supporting a MI6 initiative to overthrow Mossadegh in Iran, which the U.S. did go along with, unfortunately. However, it did seem that Eisenhower had certain regrets and pulled back, evidenced in his non-willingness to support the British-Israeli attempt to go to war with Egypt just a couple of years later over the Suez Canal being nationalized. And then his additional support or effort to advance the Atoms for Peace initiative, where the U.S. would become supportive of Iran's ambitions to have an advanced industrial, technologically advanced society driven by nuclear power. The first generation of Iranian nuclear scientists were, after all, trained in the United States. And today we're seeing certain remarks being made by Trump. I don't know how viable. I hope they're very viable, which run parallel to that, where there seems to be a break from Anglo-Israeli ambitions once more, which did seem to have a certain orientation. Trump just said something to the effect that $30 billion might be made available for Iran to access civilian nuclear power, as well as, I think, unfreezing something like $6 billion that have been frozen for decades from Iran that could also facilitate, and maybe also relieving some of the sanctions. These are all positive things. Additionally, there seems to be a thawing of the relationship between the USA and Russia. Putin came out with some very, very positive remarks about President Trump and vice versa just yesterday. And then there's the question of China, which Trump even said he hopes that China is now going to be able to do more business with Iran and maybe even buy oil from the United States, he's remarked. So these are very hopeful. Do you see any possible traps, or do you think that this is all authentic, legitimate initiatives coming from the U.S. side to really make a break and fully set a genuinely nationalistic policy in motion based upon cooperation with major powers around the world? Do you think that that's really fully a pure thing?
I mean, I think it's certainly feasible, and I also think as well that, like, Trump for all of the criticisms one might make of him, like, actually, like, I mean, this stuff gets very little, if any, media attention, but he has played peacemaker successfully before. So, like, it's rather forgotten that Saudi Arabia and Qatar were on the verge of war during his first term. And Trump warned the Saudis off. I mean, there were Saudi forces massing on the border with Qatar. Trump warned them off this and signed a mutual defense agreement with Qatar, which put that conflict on, complete ice. Recently, as in, a few days ago, Trump brokered a peace deal between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, who have been at effective war with each other for decades. So again, cause for cautious optimism. Trump did come in saying I would end the war in Ukraine within 48 hours, and talking about arms reduction between China and defense spending reduction between China, Russia, and the US. And then that doesn't seem to have happened, and now he's talking about $1 trillion defense budget, etc. So I mean, he's nothing if not fickle and variable. Yes, there are encouraging signs, and I think that particularly given that. There are, some of the comments that have emanated from Marco Rubio, of all people, who I always just assumed to be this kind of deranged hawk with his fake backstory that, oh, my family fled communist Cuba, when in reality they fled Batita's brutal fascist US-backed dictatorship. And then, so he's not this kind of victim of communism as he claimed. But one of his first speeches after he became Secretary of State was he talked about how the unipolar world is over, and it was this rather incongruous and ahistorical upshot of the Soviet Union collapsing and the US having zero major economic or military competitors whatsoever. And that this was never going to be a permanent state of affairs. So I mean, it does seem that there is some sense within the imperial brain trust that the US total US hegemony cannot continue. But I mean, not only that. I mean, if you look at just basic figures on trade, for instance, the overwhelming majority of the world does considerably more trade with China and receives considerably more investment from China than the US, and that's not something that can be reversed. I mean, we are way past that point. So I mean, just waking up to the realities of this stuff. I mean, what one might say, that's not necessarily something to be praised or celebrated, but I mean, again, for all of the hawkishness of European leaders, there are encouraging signs that some pockets of sanity and rationality still endure among Germany's political class. So, as I mentioned, German Chancellor Merz is engaging in a lot of fiery rhetoric and is talking about building the most powerful army in Europe. I've seen this film twice. I know how it ends. But recently, I saw there was a great report on Substack by Brian McDonald, who is this kind of Irish-born, Russian-residing geopolitical commentator and journalist, and he reported on how that members of the Germany's Social Democratic Party, they have published a manifesto in advance of their party conference, basically saying, talking to Russia and having dialogue with Russia is not the same as agreeing with them or being assets of them.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's just seems like plain common sense. But in the current kind of frenzy within Western Europe, this actually all sounds rather radical and subversive. But as I might add, and I think, sorry, as I might have said, that position is reflective of wider public opinion, and it's not just restricted to Germany. We're seeing huge not just fractures but fissures between where governments stand on particular issues and public opinion. If you look at polls on Israel Gaza, say, overwhelmingly, even in countries like Germany, where there is bizarrely, I think, due to historical guilt, so quite high levels of sympathy, public sympathy for Israel, people are turning against Tel Aviv in mass numbers. Meanwhile, their governments remain signed up entirely to the Zionist agenda and are very keen to keep the Gaza genocide going and supply Israel with the necessary political, financial, military, and diplomatic backing to help them do this. But it is a fundamentally unsustainable situation where you have up to 90% of the population opposing something a government is doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, just this week, Mark Carney in Canada has committed Canada to the EU-Canada Comprehensive Partnership, which also involves supporting or providing Canadian full support to rearm Europe. There was no vote. There was no. I mean, this is not something that there's even messaging going around right now trying to convince Canadians that half of us want to join Europe. That I don't think that that's true in any way, but that's being put forth into the psyche to try to nudge people in a certain direction. So it's very clear that the population doesn't support a lot of these devastating geopolitical ambitions, but this is being done despite all of that. I've got a quick question now on, there is a startling, I'm bringing up Canada here, but you have a startling array, and maybe people make too much out of this, but I'm curious to get your thoughts of current technocrats in powerful positions across the transatlantic, Chrystia Freeland being one of them, but also you have obviously Merz, Ursula herself, the new MI6 director, what's her name? Blaise Metrovelli or whatever. Who have
Nazi spawn.
Yeah, Nazi spawn, right? And I mean, we're not talking about people who are just like fighting with the Nazis because that was just where they were living at the time in and around Germany, and so they had to be. We're talking very high level officials in the Nazi high command, and there's certainly a continuity of policy and agenda and methodology that we've seen from, as you said, the first two screenings of this film decades ago. Do you think that people are making too much out of the family connections behind a lot of these ghouls, or do you think that there's something more to it?
Well, I mean, I think number one, the fact that the British media is all over this story is because they want to head off the fact that the Russian media would have an absolute field day with it. I mean, you can't really get much more on the nose than the new head of MI6 being the granddaughter of a Red Army defector. Someone who defected from the Soviet Union's military to assist the Nazis and was known as the Butcher, and just so happened to come from hail from Ukraine. But it's like, I mean, I think that again, this is something that I've written about, is that extensively, is that the MI6 and the CIA, it must be said, they backed ultra-nationalist, fascist, and neo-Nazi elements within the Soviet sphere as it existed. In many cases, these people or their progeny became leaders of the post-communist states of Central and Eastern Europe. Kaya Kallas, who I mentioned, she talks a lot about how members of her family were deported from Estonia, after the war. Of course, the obvious question of what precisely her family was doing during
Yeah.
World War II is not asked, and it's not something that she's keen to speak about. But yeah, these are the kind of elements that Britain and America have been supporting. In the case of Ukraine, again, I have an extensive investigation on this on my website. The British were very keen to use Stepan Bandera, who is regarded as kind of the godfather of Ukrainian ultranationalism. The MI6 were very keen to use him and his assets within Ukraine for sabotage, assassinations, all sorts of other dark arts and dirty tricks. The CIA were like urging MI6 not to. And I might add as well that like in the immediate after World War II, it's well known that the CIA smuggled a large number of Nazi scientists into the US under Project Paperclip, or allowed people like Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, to flee to Latin America, where they then worked for the CIA. The British did exactly the same thing, but nobody knows about it because no records have been released on this, and the British government has never formally admitted that this happened, but it did. So that raises very obvious questions about about the new MI6 chief's origins, and the fact that the media is very keen to downplay this should tell you they're telling you not to look at this, so you should look at this. In brief, and I think that she's taking over from the former MI6 chief Richard Moore, who was meeting personally with Zelensky in the lead up to the conflict. Questions abound over whether Zelensky was seen by the British and perhaps the Americans too as a way of ensuring that they got what they wanted, which was all-out proxy war with Russia, but with a friendlier face attached to it, because the post-Maidan government, which was handpicked by Victoria Nuland during that notorious "fuck the EU" call, and then Petro Poroshenko's government, who replaced them and was elected. I mean, they were a bunch of fascist lunatics. Yep. With openly neo-Nazi officials in influential positions. So Zelensky, who was elected on a peace ticket of reunifying the country, of and restoring relations with Russia, actually ended up being the perhaps ideal vehicle for bringing war to Ukraine, which is what they wanted all along. And yes, as I say, I mean, Richard Moore, the Ukrainian ultra, has now been replaced by someone who is directly descended from a Ukrainian neo-Nazi, or sorry, Ukrainian Nazi, not even neo. So I mean, that's quite interesting, and it might give us a hint at where MI6 is going to go with this moving forward.
Yeah, and anybody who wants to look into these claims a little bit more, just Google it, or just Google the name Konstantin Dobrovolsky, who was known as the Butcher and had signed letters to Heil Hitler. This was a high-level person tied to the Waffen-SS. Just absurd. You can't even make this up. So
no, you can't.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling. And on top of that, I would just throw this out before I turn to a few people who have been waiting to pose a question to you. I was surprised just to do a little bit of scratching behind the surface of what Alan Dulles and British intelligence had gotten away with and unchallenged after World War II, as far as installing a variety of high-level Nazi killers and fascists more broadly from Italy and from France, as well as from Japan, into high-level managerial positions after the war. That also included the Mossad. And I was just reading this article the other day when Israel hired ex-Nazi officers, going through Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's top killer, who was hired to inform, to train the early Mossad after it had been created in 1951, modeled on the CIA, which itself was modeled on MI6. And it's just shocking that you have these sorts of strange connections that have never been properly resolved in a full way, but that when you acknowledge them, it helps us resolve so many discontinuities and paradoxes that seem absurd when you just look at it from a myopic standpoint in the present. But you're like, okay, these are factors that are actually helping to make some sense of the madness, although it's still mad, but at least the mind can hold on to something a little bit more. So the question that I saw come up here, there's a few, is from Gerald, who asks for Kit, if Trump were declared the winner in the 2020 presidential election, which many say was stolen, and if Biden had been kept out, do you think there would have been a Russia-Ukraine war or not?
It's difficult to say with absolute certainty. I mean, I think that you've got to bear in mind that as again we've discussed Russiagate, the explicit purpose of Russiagate was to bounce Trump into an a hostile position on Russia, and this was the like Britain's doing. It's difficult to know. Although I think that the real foundations of the proxy conflict in Ukraine were laid under Biden. Who, of course, had significant financial interests in Ukraine and an enormous amount of clout within Ukraine. Now, after failing to hold, as promised, referendums on autonomous status for Lugansk and Donetsk, and being openly threatened by Western-backed Azov fighters, Zelensky then basically went for war. He passed a presidential decree calling for the reintegration of the two breakaway republics and Crimea, and then Ukrainian forces began massing in the south and the east of the country, preparing for all-out invasion. Now, if Trump had successfully won the 2020 election, we might speculate that he would have been suitably emboldened to not let this happen, or to tell them to back off. Again, this is just a matter of speculation, but I think that having spent his first term fighting off these false British concocted allegations that he was a Russian asset, he would have perhaps felt suitably vindicated to say no and not let it go ahead. Biden, who, I mean, we now, even the mainstream media is admitting, was just completely out of his mind, to the point that he had to use a teleprompter during fundraisers in private homes. And it's also been reported that the CIA and Pentagon enjoyed having Biden in office because they could just do whatever they wanted, because he was just completely fried in the head that he had no sway. Trump seems a lot. During his second term, he seems like a lot more authoritative and forceful. And it caught my eye the other day. There was this Politico interview with Marco Rubio where Rubio said, like, Trump takes advice from us, but once he makes a decision, we have to appreciate and respect that and follow his orders. It's not our job to spend all day trying to change his mind, which is very, that's how the system should work. And that's how it did work under Eisenhower and FDR and Kennedy and other presidents. Not so much after the CIA killed Kennedy in 1963. I think that, like, yes, having gotten that second, mandate, I think we can speculate that he would have tried to avoid this, whereas Biden just sat back while the Ukrainians prepared for war. And there's also, there's another data point here as well, which I think is quite interesting, is that, when the mass Ukrainian artillery shelling of the Donbass began in kind of mid-February 2022, Biden was saying that, I know that the Russians are going to invade. I know the Russians are going to invade. Now, might that have been because the US signed off on the Ukrainian shelling of Donbass, which was almost certainly a precursor to a planned ground invasion?
Yep. There's also the point I was just thinking about too, is that the U.S. ambassador that participated and testified against Trump in his the I don't know if that was the second or third attempt to impeach him in 2019 or 2020 had said something to the effect that if we allow Trump to be in power any longer, he'll accommodate and give Putin everything he's asking for. So there's these factors too to hold in mind. So maybe it's possible, probable, I would say even, that there would not necessarily have been such a conflict emerging in 2022. The question that I have here is from Dario, asking. Oh, here, I'll just put it up on the screen. Dario asks, is it being considered that British and Ukrainian intelligence might concoct a large-scale false flag operation against Ukrainian civilians to be blamed on Russia to kill any peace deal?
Well, I mean, again, that is certainly an option, but what's actually quite interesting is that, I mean, look, one civilian casualty is too many, right? I mean, and I'm someone who has a visceral aversion to all armed conflict. You know, even though I do recognise that Russia had more legitimate grounds for what it is doing than the US and Britain did in invading Iraq, say. Okay. There were reasons this happened that weren't related to wanting to extract oil or, you know, dominate the Middle East. But the point is that like the Russians have been extremely careful to avoid civilian casualties during this conflict. They have not engaged in, as we mentioned, kind of shock and awe bombing, indiscriminate targeting of civilian centres. But the narrative that they are deliberately killing civilians has been in place since the start of this. Boris Johnson, funnily enough, exploited false claims that Russian forces had committed genocide in Bucha, the Ukrainian town, to justify the keeping the war going and sabotaging peace negotiations, which were a signature away from being signed. So, I mean, that narrative of deliberate Russian targeting of civilians is already there. It must not be forgotten, though, that, I mean, in terms of false flags, I mean, this has kind of dropped off the radar, with amazing speed. But if we go back to April this year, there was a Wisconsin teenager, a guy called Nikita Kasap, who I believe was of Moldovan descent. He killed his parents in order to finance an elaborate scheme to assassinate Donald Trump.
Oh, is that the kid who was involved with the Order of the Nine Angles satanic cult? Yeah. And what's been rather, I mean, and it's astonishing that this is, you know, yet another Trump. I mean, this is what, the third attempted Trump assassination, which has just been completely forgotten. What the mainstream media, which initially gave this blanket coverage, didn't pick up on was that the publicly available FBI affidavit on his arrest and their investigation, it has numerous passages which state that he was in direct contact with individuals on Telegram who used Ukrainian telephone numbers and conversed with him in Cyrillic text. And they explicitly stated that the purpose of killing Trump was so that Russia would be blamed for it. Yeah.
I mean, what could be more suspicious than that? And this is after there was that other dude, what was his name? Ryan Ralph, who was this kind of Ukrainian ultra who had tried to recruit foreign soldiers to fight for Ukraine, and had traveled to DC and Kiev as part of this campaign. And you know, he was, you know, plotting to kill Trump as well. You know, so it does seem that these efforts are ongoing, you know, in order to provoke something.
Yeah. On that note, there is I don't know, maybe actually a slightly different note. We have currently announced what seems to be moving ahead in the Middle East right now is what's known as the Abraham Shield plan that I was just looking into. I don't know if you've looked into this too much yet at this point, which involves a program. As far as I can see so far, it's a U.S. funded program, which would be highly, you know, it'd be a U.S. Israeli joint program principally, to involve providing 4 nations that would be involved in the Abraham Accords: Egypt, UAE, I think Saudi Arabia might be involved, to administer Gaza, replace and facilitate, to facilitate mass Gazans who want to leave Gaza, to pay for their departure. A reconstruction program would be put in place. I think Egypt was the first to float this. That was unanimously accepted by various Arab states some months back. A 2-state solution would be involved. PLO control. I mean, so Hamas would be ousted, would just completely leave, and the PLO would take control. Do you see this having any negative side aspects to it, or does this seem like a positive program for the Middle East, or is this not something you've looked at enough to comment?
Well, I mean, I've certainly looked at the various different like plans that have been mooted. I mean, they all just seem complete, like they all seem like non-starters to me, because you have so many different components within this. Like, you know, you have Saudi Arabia, which, I mean, is it would never admit it, but is basically signed up to the Israeli agenda, but they've not formalized relations yet, and Saudi Arabia hasn't recognized Israel yet, and this is something that, you know, it's been Donald Trump has even deprioritized this, which is quite interesting. This was a key US objective, to get Riyadh to recognize Israel, and apparently this is on hold for the time being. But there are a large number of plans which or they suffer the problem that there are so many different interests and so many different actors involved in this, that arriving at any deal is almost impossible, it seems. So you have the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, who are worried about Gaza, a post-war Gaza where they're not involved, and they think this might lead to them getting sidelined and their international funding being cut off. So they have a vested interest in a peace deal such as you described not going ahead. Okay. You also have like the Saudis are opposed to the Palestinians being shunted out of Gaza, which has been repeatedly mooted. You know, Egypt is not willing, and Egypt and Jordan were 2 countries that were mooted as potential destinations for Palestinian refugees. They are vehemently opposed to these plans. It got so desperate that at one stage, Somaliland, which is this kind of breakaway, unrecognized statelet in the Horn of Africa, and funnily enough, is effectively a British neo-colony where its entire government infrastructure, including its military, security, and intelligence services, is basically run by the British. That was being considered as a dumping ground for displaced Palestinians, and a way of solving this problem. That seems to have been rather forgotten now, because again, I mean, you know, the Palestinians were never ever going to, you know, accept being forcibly displaced to Africa. You know, I mean, it's so. I think that all of and another key problem is that you know, Hamas is not going to allow a re-emergence of the Gaza that existed before, which was effectively an open-air concentration camp. Yeah. So, like, finding a resolution for this that does not factor in all of these different interests and perspectives and actors, which is a very difficult thing to do. I mean, it would be one hell of a balancing act. But I mean, Trump at the same time has shown a willingness to engage in dialogue with different sides, including Hamas, which is again, you know, kind of a low-key seismic development. You know, like, because the official position is of successive US governments has been, we don't negotiate with terrorists, and Hamas is a prescribed terrorist organization. So I mean, you know, we shall see. But I think that, particularly while the war is ongoing, and indeed in a context where the military vulnerabilities and shortcomings of the US and Israel have been pretty large recently. Like, like what hand do they have to play in negotiations? We won't. I mean, would Israel say, we promise to not nuke you if you sign off on it? I mean, it's just kind of inconceivable to me, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so I thank you immensely for sharing your insights. I mean, I really do hope that we're finally. I still have my doubts that it's as easy as it seems to be so far to get a real authentic off ramp after so many generations that have an eschatological, in some cases, aspect to them to justify the idea of a greater Israel that would expand and claim some sort of promised land far, far larger than the current borders of Israel. Allow that also has contaminated a lot of the thinking of many of the Crusader neocon sort of Christian Zionist types inside of U.S. policymaking circles. But I hope so. I mean, I really do. And let alone a lot of the jaded romanticists who have looked upon the Nazi era and the failures of the Nazis to achieve their New World Order ambitions to turn Russia into a slave colony with sadness, and have been trying to sort of undo the mistake made of World War II going the way it did. With a new turn, a new effort that involves a massively expanded NATO, a global NATO, and all of these things. But again, I really hope there's some adults in the room that currently there's evidence of it. There's certainly some policy actions that showcase that this is something to sink one's teeth into. I'm not going to swallow it yet, but we'll see. What are your thoughts before we go to some final parting remarks?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a great quote from Blackadder, which is this British comedy show, which is if nothing else works, then a total pig-headed unwillingness to look facts in the face will see us through. I mean, I hope that's not where our optimism comes from, but there are there are reasons for cautious optimism all the time, and I do think that I mean, for instance, the China-Russia relationship, again, in the spirit of being told where not to look, being a guide to where you should look, the Western media is absolutely determined to sow doubt and if not outright or incite mockery of Russia and China's no limits partnership, which has already been world changing in many ways. And there are countries all over the world which are now looking to alternative non-Western structures for economic, military, and political alliance. And this is just the start of it. So there is no guide. We are in a period of immense unrest and upheaval the world over, and it would be wrong-headed to make kind of concrete predictions about what will and won't happen. But at the same time, that the encouraging indicators are there.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody who speaks too absolutely in their language about what they are certain of at this point in time, I'd say are just completely out to lunch. It's good to have an open-mindedness to consider all factors at play and not be too attached to any given hypothesis at any moment, but at the same time, hope for the best and do our part to amplify what is necessary and what is possible. So for that, Kit, your work has been exceptional. It's been brilliant. It's been so important to help people just navigate through this very, very shadowy minefield of cloak and daggers and psyops and games within games. So I appreciate this immensely. Thank you so much. And hopefully next week or in 2 weeks' time when we do this again, we'll have Ray McGovern who can join us. I think there were some technical issues on his side, but all I have to say, your links to all of your work, as well as shameless plug, your website will be in the description box. I love that. It's a great title. And I look forward to Matt. I look forward to future chats. Take care.
Absolutely. Take care, my friend.
Bye-bye.